Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 101 material. This is Chapter 8 of the Philosophy of Mind textbook on freedom of the will. So this chapter is essentially a culmination of a lot of the topics that are under consideration in terms of how we respond to the relationship between mind and body. And more importantly, I think this is a topic that we discuss in so many different ways, not just in philosophy, but especially in psychology, in neuroscience, in popular culture. And that's how free are we? Do we have free will? Are we able to make choices that aren't determined by other causes or antecedent causes? So hopefully, if you're anything like me, you've thought about free will before you really knew what the terms of the debate were. I certainly think this is perhaps the one of the most important questions in metaphysics, and something that does have serious repercussions for everyday life. Specifically, if things are determined, how can we hold people morally responsible or legally responsible for their actions? That's certainly a big one. So a lot of overlap with questions in law, and as well as ethics. And there have been even some quite famous cases in recent years about these kinds of defenses in terms of how people are raised as being a reason for people not to be held accountable for something, right? So there's a lot of practical implications for our views on free will, and certainly I think it's something that affects all of us on a certain level. So interesting, a lot of interesting things. I'll try to keep this brief to kind of give us a broad overview of the dominant views in the free will discussion. So we've already talked about substance dualism. We've already talked about materialism and behaviorism, which certainly has views on free will. We talked about functionalism, and now we want to talk about free will. So what's the general philosophical problem of free will? Well, it boils down fundamentally to how do we reconcile determinism, the idea that some things are beyond our control, with our intuitions or ideas about personal freedom. So in other words, it seems like we want to say that I'm free to choose what to eat for breakfast in the morning. But it also seems true that a lot of things about what I choose to eat and what I don't eat, those are determined by factors outside of me or not in my control. So, in other words, my tastes, my environmental factors, genetics, those are things that aren't in my control. So, they're determined. So, how do I reconcile those facts with my intuitions about me having some sense of freedom about making those decisions? Because we all seem to have a notion of free will. It's a very intuitive concept that we're free to choose among different possibilities what to have for lunch or what clothes to wear or right, any kind of selection process. We think we're completely free to choose one way or the other. But as I just mentioned, we're also faced with the reality that many choices, if there are such things, have already been determined, right? Just because we think we have free will doesn't prove that we do have it, even if we really want to have that idea. It seems that I make my own choices every day, right? I mean, there are lots of examples we could point to: clothes, food, you name it. However, it also seems that many of our choices are caused by various factors or limited by what I own, what is clean, what is available, things like that. So if I could not have chosen a different outfit, then I did not freely choose the outfit I'm wearing. Okay, so what do we typically mean by free will? One place to start might be something like when someone has the ability to do otherwise. In other words, to choose a course of action from among various alternatives. That's typically what we mean by free will in these philosophical discussions. And why is this significant? Well, free will is required, many think, with combined with a knowledge of alternative choices. That's how we get notions of moral responsibility, right? So if we apply it to a simple case, let's say that I throw my bottle of water out my car window on the way to work and it hits somebody, right? Which I'm not recommending. I don't condone littering or violence, right? Any of that. But we think, well, I had free will and I had an alternative choice not to throw the bottle of water out the window. So I should be held morally and perhaps legally responsible for doing that, right? So moral responsibility rests in large part on the ability to do otherwise, because it seems weird to hold people responsible if they couldn't have done otherwise. And this is different from just pure freedom of action, because success in carrying out our will depends on a number of factors outside of our control, right? So that's moral responsibility is a very loaded philosophical concept, but we'd like to think that we're only going to hold people responsible in case they could have done otherwise, right? So hopefully you're seeing why free will is really crucial for that discussion. Okay, so here are the biggest views on free will in a nutshell. So we have indeterminism, which is the view that not every event is determined by preceding events and the laws of nature. We'll have a view called compatibilism, which grants that there's some things that are determined, but there's some notion under which our actions can be perceived as free. And then sometimes compatibilism is just called soft determinism. There's some amount of compatibility between things being determined and things being free. So for incompatibilism, again, this is the view that if determinism is true, no one can act freely. In other words, it's the view that determinism and free will are not compatible. They're incompatible. We can't have it both ways. Either things are determined or they're free, but they can't be both. It's incompatible to suggest otherwise. One view called libertarianism, which is not our first intuition about libertarianism might be to think of it as a political view. That's not what we mean here. This is the view in free will that some actions are just completely free. They're ultimately, they might be caused, but it's ultimately up to the person or agent to decide, right? So if you're a libertarian about free will, you think we're ultimately free to make decisions, nothing is determined, or the things that are determined have nothing to do with human choices. That's one view. Now, if you're a determinist on the other end of the spectrum, you think that every event, either through our knowledge of physics or from our knowledge of brain science, that every event is determined by preceding events and the laws of nature. So if you're of this view, then you think there is no free will. Okay, so hopefully it's clear why these two views are so different, because if you're a determinist, you think everything's determined, right? From what I think I chose for breakfast this morning is determined by what I ate yesterday and before, the way I was raised, all kinds of other things, right, that have shaped my tastes, none of which were really under my control. I mean, I might have thought that I had control, but they were really determined by things outside of my choice. Whereas libertarianism is the view that there is free will, and that even views about or possibilities about breakfast show that I'm ultimately free to choose whatever I want. And so I have free will to do so. Okay, so again, determinism is the view that every event is determined by preceding events and the laws of nature. There are different types of determinism. If you're a hard determinist, you definitely think that there's no free will and no one acts freely, whether because of some preceding brain state or because of things outside of your control. And there's no free will under these views because the universe is just causally determined, going all the way back to the Big Bang. None of us really choose anything freely, according to hard determinism. This might remind you of another term called fatalism, right? So if you're a fatalist, you might think, look, everything's already predetermined. Everything is fated to happen one way or the other. And it's really not up to us to decide what those are, right? Things have already been pre-scripted, right? So you might have seen this discussion in a movie or a show or a book or something like that. If you're a fatalist, then you just think things have already been written, right? And our job is to just maybe understand those events, but we certainly don't have any ultimate influence over them one way or the other. So another way of framing this is, can there be free will if the universe is causally determined? If your answer is yes, then you might be a compatibilist. You might think, well, there are things that are determined that we don't have any choice over, but that can still be compatible with a notion of free will. So if your answer is yes to that, then compatibilism might seem appealing to you. If your answer is no, then again, you're an incompatibilist. You don't think that determinism is compatible with any notion of free will. Now, according to the incompatibilists, the question is there free will then? Is there any notion of free will that we can salvage? Well, this is where libertarianism comes in, because if you're a libertarian, you think the universe is not causally determined. All right. So hopefully you're seeing that these views really matter. The nuts and bolts, the details of these views really say different things. Of course, again, just to emphasize, there's no free will according to hard determinism, because the universe is just causally determined. There's no room for free will anyway, because everything's already determined. So let's talk a little bit more about determinism. So if determinism is true, then every event is the result of either events in the distant past, like the beginning of the universe, and the laws of nature that rule those events, like our best physics and chemistry, things like that, genetics. One proponent of this view is a famous French philosopher, Baron d'Holbach, and he was a hard determinist. And he says, man's life is a line that nature commands him to describe upon the surface of the earth, without his ever being able to swerve from it, even for an instant. Nevertheless, in despite of the shackles by which he is bound, it is pretended he is a free agent. So he's echoing a very common sentiment, which is, we might think we have free will, but at the end of the day, look, we are here because of forces outside of our control, and that's human life is slated to essentially give us a notion of free will, but that we don't really have. So here's an argument for hard determinism. If determinism is true, then we do not have free will. Cannot both be true because they are incompatible. Premise 2, determinism is true because of empirical knowledge, because of what we know about psychology, because of what we know about physics. The conclusion, therefore, we do not have free will. And libertarianism is false. So this is hard determinism. Essentially, the more we understand about psychology and understand the human brain, and the more we understand about physics, the more we'll realize that we don't have free will. Here's the indeterminist argument for free will. If indeterminism is true, then we have free will, because there is some notion of free will that we can salvage. Indeterminism is true since not every event is determined by preceding events and the laws of nature. Therefore, we do have free will, and thus libertarianism is true. So if you think that there are at least some things that are determined, but not everything, then maybe you're an indeterminist. Okay, so on a traditional reading or definition of free will, what we mean is something like we could do otherwise, right? You would have been able to do something different if you had wanted to. So for example, for breakfast, I could have had tea instead of my usual coffee. I was free to do that. I was free to do otherwise other than coffee. But we might ask here, well, what exactly does it mean that I could have had tea this morning? Because I never have tea in the morning. I mean, I like tea, but I never choose tea for breakfast. I'm always a coffee person with breakfast. I mean, I'm free in the sense that if I had really desired to do something different than what I actually did, nothing prevented me from having tea this morning. But at some point, the determinist is going to come in and say, your prior days determine your subsequent days, right? And going all the way back, as far as I can remember, I've had coffee in the morning, right? I've never really deviated from that ever, except maybe a handful of times. So it doesn't really make sense to say that Anthony is free to choose tea in the morning, right? Those things are pretty much already determined. That's what a determinist is going to say. Now, in order for libertarians, though, to argue that free will and determinism are compatible, they typically redefine what free will is, since the traditional definition as the ability to do otherwise is not easily made compatible with determinism for reasons I just mentioned. So this is where compatibilism comes in. Compatibilism, again, thinks that determinism is true, but it's also compatible with a notion of free will. So compatibilists might argue that even though our desires are determined, we can still act freely as long as we have the power to do what we want, like have tea in the morning, and nothing is preventing us from doing it. For example, no one is restraining or coercing us. So nothing is preventing me from having tea in the morning, and I have the power to have tea if I wanted to, even though I don't. That's enough, compatibilists will argue, for the notion that determinism and compatibilism, determinism and free will are compatible. Okay, so here's a philosopher who believes in compatibilism. This is W.T. Stace. He thinks the problem is really just how we frame things. It's just about words. Traditionally, we have defined it, this free will debate, to only lead to incompatibilism. But whether or not the world is deterministic is actually irrelevant, because even those who doubt free will act as if they have it. This is an interesting argument. I mean, even if people claim that we don't have free will, we all act as if we do, right? So isn't that enough for compatibilism, Stace argues. So perhaps we need to redefine free will, right? We need to talk about acts freely done versus not freely done. They're free when they're caused by internal factors, right? Psychological, whereas they're not free when they're caused by external factors. So again, to go back to the coffee example, Stace would argue, look, I'm free to choose tea because those are caused by internal factors, internal to Anthony. They wouldn't be free if someone was saying every morning, you must make coffee or else, I'm going to hurt you. That's not a free choice, right? That's caused by external factors or physical factors. But they're free in the sense that if they're internal factors to Anthony or psychological factors, they are free. So Stace says maybe we need to just redefine what we mean by free will. And it's also helps the case, he thinks, because even the people who claim that we don't have free will live their lives as if we do. So isn't that enough? So at one point we might ask, well, why does the traditional definition entail incompatibilism? Well, because if hard determinism is true, then we have no power over past events and the laws of nature. They're not up to us, right? So what's the point? And if they're not up to us, then their consequences, including our current actions, are not really up to us either. My choice to have coffee this morning really isn't open to us. Isn't open to me, even if I think it is. If the consequences of past events, including our current actions, are not up to us, then there are no free actions. So in other words, if hard determinism is true, then there are no free actions. This is the problem with incompatibilism. So people like Stace argue that no, they are compatible. If free will is defined correctly, they'll argue, then free will exists and compatible with determinism. We can have both determinism and free will coexist or be made compatible. So Stace would say we have redefined free will, so it is now correct. Therefore, free will can exist and is compatible with determinism. So how does compatibilism handle complex cases? Well, how about this example? Suppose somebody asked me or robbed me of my wallet at gunpoint. Hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone, me, you, anyone, but suppose that it is. So the question in terms of free will is, do I hand it over freely? Do I give my wallet over to the robber freely? Well, in one sense, yes, because it is the fear of death that compels me to hand over my wallet. So in other words, it's internal to me out of fear of death to give over my wallet freely. But also no, because I wouldn't be handing over my wallet unless somebody was robbing me, right? So that is external. The gun approximates physical force that's external to me. What about predictability, like being able to predict these things? Well, this doesn't threaten the conception of free will, since if one's internal states were different, then a different action could be predicted, but they'd still be free. So any cases which do not fit the definition given can be explained by the choice of words used, right? So Stace would say, yeah, we can make sense of free will in this case because there's still internal causes as well as external causes, but that doesn't mean we have to give up on free will. They're compatible for different reasons. So how about against compatibilism? Well, here's an argument against the kind of view that we get from Stace. If compatibilism is true, then an agent who does what they want without external constraints acts freely. But it seems clear from certain thought experiments like brain implants that an agent can do what they want without external constraints and still not act freely. Thus, compatibilism is false. So one problem is that real freedom is not just the power to act if we will to act, but power over the will itself. So a lot of critics of compatibilism are going to say that compatibilists are they're playing fast and loose with this distinction. It's one thing to say that we have a power to act, but really what this entails is the power over the will. So let's take another case. Am I free to stop eating ice cream or pizza after a certain slice or a certain number of bites? It's not that I'm free. It's not that the question is whether I'm free to eat more ice cream. The question is really, do I have the power over my own will to stop eating so much ice cream after a certain point? That seems like a difference that matters, right? Of course, I'm free to eat or not eat the ice cream. But the real question is, do I have the willpower, right? The power over my will to stop eating the ice cream? And that seems for many people to be a problem with compatibilism, that they're equivocating almost between the power to act with the power over the will to act. So some people might just say, look, instead of just arguing that it's compatible, let's just take the libertarian side of things and run with it, right? The best evidence of the existence of free will just comes from anecdotal experience, our own experience. When making a choice, we often sense that we have genuine options. I can get this ice cream or this ice cream. I can have tea or coffee and so on. That we have the power to choose or not choose among alternative courses of action, and that we finally choose and do is genuinely and ultimately up to us. So free action is caused by an agent or a person and is not wholly determined by previous events. Now, are there criticisms of this view? Yes, right, for similar reasons that have been already brought up. If libertarianism is true, then an agent's actions are rationally self-determined only if they choose in light of reasons. Premise 2, choices are rationally self-determining only if the reasons behind them are themselves chosen in light of other reasons. And these later reasons must be chosen in light of still other reasons and so on. Premise 3, so the libertarian account of free actions calls for the actual completion of an infinite regress of reasons, which is impossible. Therefore, the libertarian view of free actions is false. In other words, one criticism against libertarianism is that it seems to imply that everything that we choose to do has at some point or another already been chosen for rationally self-determining agents. In other words, I'd have to have chosen coffee and coffee and coffee for so many days, for so many years, going all the way back to some first choice. But that choice itself might not have been freely taken. Maybe it's because I was raised in a certain kind of household, or maybe it's because, right, I'm Italian and that's a cultural thing, right? And we love coffee, like a lot of other cultures do, right? So a lot of people criticize libertarianism for saying that it's just not plausible to think that we make so many choices freely over the course of our lives, where we make a lot of choices are made for us, right? By economic factors, by socio-political factors, right? By geographical factors that are just not up to us, right? The fact that I was raised in a middle-class family in the United States determines a lot, right? And it's also, those kinds of factors really determine a lot about people, right? So many people are going to press against libertarianism for similar reasons. Now, the libertarian can respond here, right? They could say something like, we should reject the suggestion that the libertarian must be assuming that the agent has further second order reasons that explain why they chose to act in accordance with one set of motives rather than another. It is not necessary to try to ascend to a level of second order reasons for acting on first order reasons in a desperate bid to render this conception of action intelligible. So in other words, the libertarian could respond with, look, we don't need to explain every single second order reason for our first order choices, right? We don't need to get that psychological about everything in order to have a free action be intelligible. This is where somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre, a famous existentialist, comes in. So Sartre is a libertarian about free will. He has a very simple question. All right, so we want a notion of free will. Here's a good example. Where do our values come from, right? So if we just ask this intuitively, something like, well, what do you value and why do you value it? Well, Sartre thinks that according to existentialists like him, human beings are nothing but what we make of ourselves. This is a famous line from Sartre. There's no human nature, according to Sartre. We choose the values that we hold dear. And because of that, the human being is condemned to be free because there are no values out there to justify their conduct. We're not born with a set of values predetermined already on us. There are no excuses for what we do. We must choose and act, but there are no guides for our choices. Sartre thinks, he calls this, we are forlorn. We are unlikely to succeed or be fulfilled because we're constantly wanting things. Our values change. We come into the world like essentially blank slates, and then from that we choose what matters to us, right? Whether it's education, whether it's honesty, whether it's hard work, right? These are things that we have to choose for ourselves. And because of that, because we choose our own values, we're free, right? We should take a libertarian account of free will as true. And therefore, we're fully responsible for our choices and our actions. We choose who we want to be. And because of that, we are condemned to be radically free. Thus, libertarianism is true. So this is the existentialist libertarian answer to the problem of free will. So here's his argument in a nutshell. Either values are created by us or they're created by God. Values have to come from somewhere. And Sartre thought that values are not created by God because there is no God. Therefore, values are created entirely by humans. So we'll skip this video for now. But hopefully this discussion really interests you. My goal here was to just talk about the major views about free will. There's a lot that I kind of skipped over, but hopefully you enjoy thinking about this really fascinating question in metaphysics. And if you have any questions about the details or specifics of any of these views, please be sure to reach out to me. But I'll post the media onto Canvas.